All right, so let me begin with a very simple question, and that is there anybody here who has never learned or studied a foreign language? Probably not. You've all studied or learned a foreign language sometime in your life, I assume. But how did you learn it? That's the problem. There are some people who have been very fortunate enough to have, for example, lived in a country where that language is spoken. And so these people will probably have learned the language in a very natural and communicative manner. Even here in Japan, you might have been in an environment where members of your family spoke a language other than Japanese, and so you were immersed in that sort of environment in your family or in your neighborhood. And anybody who's been in that sort of very fortunate environment probably were able to acquire a second or foreign language in a very natural and communicative manner. However, in most cases, in countries like Japan, which is what we call an EFL country, English as a foreign language country, which simply means that the foreign language that we're trying to learn is used only in the classroom and it's not used outside at all. The best way to learn, the most common way to learn a foreign language is through the process of learning the grammar and the forms of the language. So many of us have gone through the process of going through drills and grammar explanations and translations and memorizing vocabulary, making distinctions between the R and L, you know. All of these things were part of our education in trying to learn a foreign language, right? But is that really a good way to learn a foreign language? Now, as far as assessment or testing is concerned, teachers test our knowledge of English based on the way they teach. Therefore, when they gave us tests or assessment procedures, it was all based on how much grammar we knew, how many vocabulary or words we knew. And it was all based on our knowledge of the forms of the language. And if you get a high score on the test, you were considered to be a very highly proficient learner of English. Very highly proficient, but unable to speak or to communicate, right? Let me give you an example. Over 40 years ago, I was studying at the University of Michigan as a graduate student. And one summer, there were a group of junior high school teachers, not just English teachers, but teachers teaching social sciences, natural sciences, Japanese, physical education, art, and so forth. And I noticed that as time went by, a lot of the, not all, but of course, but a lot of the non-English teachers teaching social studies, Japanese, and so forth, would go out to the city of Ann Arbor, go hit the restaurants and the bars, and they would start making friends with the local people and other foreign students studying at the University of Michigan. But at the same time, I noticed that a lot of the Japanese English teachers stuck to themselves. They did not accompany these other teachers to the city of Ann Arbor. So I was wondering what was happening here. And I asked some of the social studies teachers what they were doing, and I was listening to their English, and what happened was I noticed that their English was not really accurate. It was not really grammatical, right? But it was communicable. They were able to communicate. Sometimes the grammar was poor, pronunciation sometimes very difficult to understand, but they were able to communicate. And they were having a good time. They were making friends. But then when it came to the Japanese teachers of English, that didn't seem to happen. Now, the social studies teachers were able to use English freely without considering mistakes because their specialty was not English. So they could make as many mistakes as they wanted in English because they were not teaching English. That was not their area of specialization. However, when it came to English teachers, their area of specialization was English. And back home in Japan, where they were teaching their students not to make mistakes in the third person singular S, Every time a student made a small mistake in the third person singular S, they would say, how many times do I have to tell you not to make that mistake? And here they were in the United States making the same mistake themselves. And they were not being able to pronounce English very well. And they knew it. They knew it. And so they were embarrassed to speak English. It was really, really interesting because one English teacher was asked by an American, what subject do you teach in Japan? And he answered, Japanese. I asked another an English teacher, and he said, you know, I was asked the same question. And I said, oh, so what did you answer? He said, I answered PE, physical education. So you didn't say you teach English? He said, no, I was too embarrassed. Because I'm teaching accuracy in Japan, but I can't be accurate here when I'm supposed to be a specialist in English. All right? But then you go back to these social studies teachers and so forth, and you begin to notice the kind of English that they are using. I mean, they're using chunks and idiomatic expressions which are necessary for shopping, ordering food and drinks at restaurants and bars, and greeting people that they do not know, introducing themselves. Real simple conversation. Most of this conversation can be held without knowledge of grammar. Because all you need are chunks and idiomatic expressions, and that's all you need. So does that mean that grammar is not important for communication? Well, that's a different question altogether. For example, if you had to do debates, discussions on very difficult topics, if you didn't know grammar, people might not understand what you're trying to say. You won't be very persuasive, that's for sure. And if you have to write an essay or a report, maybe a contract for your company, and you're not accurate in your grammar, you won't be able to do the job that you're supposed to do. So grammar is important. But what kind of grammar? Let me show you something. When you were young, and I think everybody liked music when you were a child, you would be singing along, humming along, and so forth. All right? Now, before you began singing and humming along, did you first learn the musical notes as a child? No, of course not. You started singing, right? You started singing. But does simple singing require no grammar or no knowledge of the musical notes? No. Because when somebody sings off key, what do you say? Oh, you made a mistake on the key. Which means you know musical knowledge. You have musical knowledge. Or if you want to sing along in harmony with somebody, you know that there are certain notes that you can sing with, but there are other notes that just don't seem to fit. Which means that you have knowledge, but that knowledge is implicit. It's inside. It's not explicit. You might not be able to define it, but you have knowledge. Which means that knowledge is important for any kind of activity. Now, I want you to solve this very simple question. So what is the meaning of the underlined word? I went to Kyoto during the summer. In Japanese, what is it? Itta. Okay, so that's simple enough. The second one, fill in the blank with the correct form of the verb. I have a wonderful time in Kyoto last month. So the answer is? Had. Very good. You have knowledge of English. Very good. And this is called declarative knowledge. Knowing what? You know grammar. You can talk about grammar. You can define grammar. You can describe situations and so forth. That's called declarative knowledge. What you know. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that therefore you will be able to use it in real communication situations. You just know, but you might not be able to use it. But let's take the same two words, went and have, and put it in a different context. And the context is right after summer vacation, you are back in school. And one of your friends says, hi, what did you do during the summer? And you answer, oh, hi, I went to Kyoto during the summer. Really? How was it? Oh, it was great. I had a wonderful time in Kyoto. Well, take a look. This person is using went and had. The forms are correct, which means that they have knowledge of it. whether it's declarative or explicit or not, they know it, and they're using it correctly. And this is called procedural knowledge. Knowledge of how to use this knowledge in communicative situations. And this is the kind of knowledge which is lacking in our educational system at the present time. In the new course of study, or the National Guidelines for the Teaching of English, I've been involved in the creation of that. One of the major changes that we have made is in changing the focus from teaching pure declarative knowledge, 知識技能, to making use of that knowledge in practical or more communicative situations. 思考力、判断力、表現力. So you have knowledge, but you have to be able to use that to think, to make decisions, and to express yourself. And that's procedural knowledge. The same thing is happening in the new national entrance examination. The center shiken, as some people call it. At the present time, there are some so-called indirect questions, indirect speaking questions, where you are asked to figure out which of the words have a different vowel pronunciation, or which of the words have the accent on a different syllable. And that's supposed to show you, that's supposed to measure the indirect knowledge of speaking. That's absurd. That's just simple declarative knowledge, right? And so, what have we done with the new test? And this is going to be used. We put this knowledge within the listening text, within the reading text, without explicitly asking if you know it or not. And so, what it means is that unless you know it, you won't be able to talk about it. Okay? And that's the major point. So the last problem is this. How do you acquire this procedural knowledge? The only way you can acquire procedural knowledge is by using the form in a meaningful context. Not simply drilling, but using it in a meaningful context. So you have declarative knowledge. Procedural knowledge, as time goes on, the more you use it in an actual context, the more procedural knowledge is acquired. I think I've gone over time, so I'll finish. Thank you very much.